my name's Ptolemy Tompkins. I'm a writer and editor. And in January of 2012, I got a call from my agent. And she told me about this manuscript they had by this surgeon who had had some kind of near-death experience. And 2011 and 2010 as well had been really big years for near-death experience books. There was The Little Kid Who Went to Heaven, Heaven is for Real. I hadn't read it, but I saw it everywhere. And those years were also, of course, big years for pop atheism, for people like Christopher Hitchens to snort and fume that there was no spiritual world and there was no God and it was all ridiculous. So this was a really big pop cultural clash that was going on. So it made sense to me that my agent would be interested in selling a near-death experience book. She said, he's really great, but the manuscript's too long. It needs somebody to kind of cut it down, shape it a little bit. So I said, sure, that sounded like fun. I'd written a book called The Modern Book of the Dead. I like the subject of the afterlife. It sounded like fun. So I talked to the guy on the phone, and he had this mellifluous Southern doctor kind of voice. And then I saw a picture of him, and I was like, oh, forget it. He's got this, he looks like Marcus Welby combined with Atticus Finch. He's this doctor, whatever this guy says, you're going to believe. He's the comforting, handsome Southern doctor. So this whole thing's going to sell itself. So I got to work on the book, and it was too big. It was way too big. It was fascinating, but it was way too big. So I was waiting around in this, and I started to see the stuff that I could cut away, and I started to see this story emerge. A marketable, popular story about this brilliant, handsome guy who had this inexplicable experience. But as I was working on it, something else started to come into focus as well. I realized that this was a story about I jotted it down yesterday because I wanted to get it right. I'm just going to quickly, I just thought to myself, think in your head what Proof of Heaven is about. And I jotted this down. A wounded healer, if any of you are Jungians, that might ring a bell, undergoes a perilous journey out of our world and into another world. It takes 7 days. It's an interesting number. During his departure, he is guarded by his sisters, who, together with his son and wife, eventually succeed in drawing him back to Earth. And during his time out of the world, this hero, this initiatic character, encounters an angelic being who is female, but whose characteristics transcend all the limitations of earthly relationships. She is more than just a person, and yet she is a person. It's like, boy, how many things does that remind me of? Also, during his absence, there's a kind of supper held by the chief females in this person's life, and it's a kind of a last supper, if you will, for this fellow who is gone, and although he's not there, he is the main character. And then this guy returns miraculously. His eyes pop open, and he's resurrected, and he comes back with this message to bring to the world that it's absolutely crucial that the world know about. So I'm sort of going along, and I'm pulling this story out, and I suddenly realized if Joseph Campbell were still alive, he would jump out of his socks if he met this surgeon. It's preposterous. Eben's story is a myth come to life, and I think it is a myth for our time. Myth not in the sense of a story that isn't true, but myth in the sense of a story that is so true that it transforms and aids in the transition of one mode of thinking and way of being to another one. So Eben is too good to be true in a lot of ways in terms of making a good bestseller, but in a lot of more important ways as well. He is a figure for our time, and he is for real. Eben and I are working on another book together right now, and it is not always easy to get him on the phone when I have a question. But I've got him right now, so I'm kind of going to blend in selfishly a few things I've been wanting to find out for the book we're working on. There is, you all know Bill McKibben, I would imagine. And he wrote, I don't know how he wants to pronounce it, but Earth with two A's, talking about how we're living on a different planet than we lived on in 1968, say. And he goes through this incredibly detailed, brilliantly laid out story of where we are now, how all the old world, all our old assumptions are falling apart, and how there's going to be a new world built much more in terms of the down-to-earth realities of the real world we live in, that we won't be living in this fantasy world of a little economic bubble that thinks it's the whole ecological world. And I follow along through the whole book, loving it, and I get to the end, and he talks about how we're going to live in these little communities apart from each other, but we are still going to be connected. It's not like we're going to be completely cut off from each other anymore, even though we're going to live much more locally. And I was getting excited about this, and I was excited to hear the reason why this was. And then Bill McKibben told me it was going to be because of the internet. And I was like, oh, come on, the internet? That's not what I wanted to hear. And Eben's journey, I think, in terms of its one aspect of its ecological side, is that the place you entered was a real place the way a national park is real. When you get out of the car and you go to a place where suddenly the wind is blowing and the trees are moving and stuff like that. Have you found any other ways to get across to people the fact that it's not Avatar, it's not a video game? That's the problem with so many near-death experience books to me. There's a kind of a gloss that suddenly comes over where you are reading about something that sounds nice, but you forget that it's real. And what you're talking about is the plants you saw are as real as these plants, right?
Much more real.
How so? Here we get to the interview part. How so?
Well, I think it's important to understand, after my coma journey, especially 4 months out, when I started to glimpse the kind of the power of certain elements of the story that forced me to realize the reality of the journey, and that it had been way too real to be real, which was how I described it to my older son, because it was. And a tremendous part of this, and when I talk about spirituality and science coming together, it's important to realize that it both bring gifts to the other. And the spiritual realm brings a gift in the form of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, and how no one on earth can give you the first sentence about how the physical brain might give rise to consciousness. And this ties in very closely with the enigma of quantum mechanics, which is something that materialist physics has been wrestling with for more than a century. And that, basically what drove the founding fathers of that field into mysticism was the fact that their experiments told them that consciousness is a far deeper mystery than just some epiphenomenon of the physical brain that doesn't really exist. And so, in fact, it's understanding that we are truly spiritual beings, that our consciousness is not derived from the brain. The brain does not create consciousness. There is an aspect of us, our soul or spirit, that is the true driver of who we are and what we are, that actually creates all of this unfolding material realm. Now, That's one side of the coin. The other side, in terms of the gifts being brought, if you look at religious writings going back in the Bible and in other texts, talking about Armageddon, talking about Second Coming, talking about Judgment Day, there's so much reference there to physical bodies returning to life, because they really had no way to conceptualize just how much the physical side is very much an illusion. And yet modern science, whether you're looking at string theory or at efforts to put quantum gravity together, it's basically pure information at the core, vibrating strings of energy in higher dimensional space-time, whatever. But it's not what it appears to be. That's what modern science will tell you front and center right now. The materialists are out to tell you that they're quite certain there's no material to the material world. So a huge part of understanding this is a complete reversal of what I used to think was the case.
And yet, we live in this material world that we appreciate a great deal, to go back to these little specific plants around us, right? Mm-hmm. And I suspect one of the reasons your story has had the impact it has is because the world you enter has got flowers, butterflies, people dancing, exactly the stuff that makes the scientists rip out their hair and stamp up and down.
Right.
Like, what do you mean, people dancing, right?
Right.
That's exactly what people want to hear from a trustworthy brain surgeon, because there's something in them that says, yes, the world is bigger than just this material world, but the world beyond this material world isn't just some vague abstraction. It's got particularity.
Right.
It's a landscape. There's another landscape above this landscape, and it's got stuff in it, and it's got quality, and it's got human and more than human experiences to give to us. And I think when people hear you say that, something inside of them jumps up and down. Because even in mystical texts, sometimes it drifts off into abstract generalities. And if you use the word, when we did the book together, Eben would use the word beautiful, and I'd say, we can't use the word beautiful anymore. And he said, but it was beautiful. I said, I don't care how beautiful it was. We need specifics. And I think that is one of the reasons your message really does belong at this conference, because we need an ecology of the spirit, a way of seeing the world as part of a multi-dimensional universe that is, there's a place for nature beyond the nature we see here, just as there's a place for us. It all continues.
Well, I think the important thing to point out is, I started my journey of writing all this down, just the facts, ma'am, putting out there what I saw, not adding anything, not pulling away things, but just as it was. And of course, I was trying to write it up as a neuroscientific report. I was trying to write it up. This is some lesson about consciousness, because my doctors kept telling me you could not have had any rich experience, especially something more real than real, because there was no place in your brain for that to happen. The neocortex was being wiped out. It's the only diagnosis that could have allowed me to come to the conclusions I came to. Now, for a long time during that process of being the neuroscientist, writing the neuroscientific report and just the facts, ma'am, I was focused on saying, well, that had to be some traces of my brain from before that kind of laid that in, and that's why it was a trick of the dying brain. Although it was too real to be real, and of course the realization I had 4 months out about my guardian angel on the butterfly wing helped me to realize it was too real to be real, because it absolutely was. Now, I made the mistake early on of thinking that was some trapping of my brain, even though it was not really Earth-like, but it did have some Earth-like features. But what I came to realize is a much better way to look at it is like Plato's world of forms that he writes about in the Phaedo, that there's an ideal realm on which this realm is based. Not just Earth, but all of this universe is based. And plus, I think that in that gateway realm, there are some kind of gifts to soften it to us. And when we come back from that realm, we try to interpret our stories, and we do that through the filter of our personal experience and our mind from before. That's another advantage of having this severe bacterial meningitis that had wiped out my memories of before, was it really was more effective at getting rid of a lot of those traces of what had been there. But I think it's important to realize that that realm, with all that glorious joy and dancing and the soaring choirs of angels above and all that, what I started to see in the near-death literature and the afterlife literature going back thousands of years were all the similarities.
Yeah.
That they're all reporting the same thing because that realm is absolutely real. And that's what finally started getting my attention. And I think that's where a lot of the lessons lie.